At 68, I stood outside a little brick flat, 2 streets back from the water in Devonport, Tasmania, keys in one hand and my first Australian lease in the other, and I was braced for the whole thing to go cold on me. Before I tell you how it actually went, do me one quick favor. If you take a second to subscribe and leave a like, it genuinely helps us out over here, and it keeps these porch-side stories coming your way. Now, let me back up a little, because I want you to feel exactly where my head was that afternoon. I'm Jim, I'm 69 now, and I've lived in Australia 10 years. But that day in Devonport, I was the new fella. No local history. No track record anybody here could look up. Just an American in his late 60s, holding a pen over paperwork on the other side of the world. And I remember the winters that pushed me here. Back in the States, that gray stretch from November on, when the sky just closes over and stays shut for months. The cold that gets into your knees. The rush of everybody going nowhere fast. I'd sit there dreaming of wide open sun, a slower morning, a bit of salt air. You've probably had that same daydream more than once. So when the chance came to rent my own place down on the Tasmanian coast, I jumped. And then the fear crept in, right on schedule. Here's exactly what I expected renting to feel like. I pictured a fat stack of forms. I pictured a credit check that would take one look at me and see nothing, because all my history sat in American banks it couldn't read. I braced for application fees, references I didn't have, and a security deposit, a big one, that I figured would vanish straight into somebody's back pocket, never to be seen again. I expected to be, at best, politely tolerated, the foreigner, the risk on paper, tolerated but watched. If you've ever pictured yourself signing a lease on the other side of the world and wondered whether they'd even take you seriously, stay with me, because this is exactly that story. Now, let me hand you something useful right up front, because I wish somebody had told me plainly, when you rent here as a newcomer with no Australian rental history, yes, you will be asked to prove yourself a little. That part is real. I'm not going to pretend it away. But it is far easier than it sounds once you know there are really just two simple ways around it. One is a letter, the other is a bigger payment up front. Both are painless. I'll walk you through exactly how each one works in a minute and how much it actually cost me. But first, a word about how I stopped guessing. Because for a while there, I was scrambling for advice in all the wrong places. Facebook groups, half-remembered tips from a buddy who'd never even been here. You know the drill. After 10 years here, I've watched a lot of good folks make that same mistake, and it drove me a little nuts. So I finally sat down and put every single question people kept asking me into one practical little ebook. It's called One Way Guide, and it's part of the One Way Club. It won't hold your hand through your whole life, but it lays out the paperwork and the money questions, the exact stuff I fumbled myself when I was standing where you are now in plain language. If you'd rather figure it all out the hard way like I did, no hard feelings. But if you want the shortcut, the link is in the description, or just scan the code on your screen. All right, back to that afternoon in Devonport. Let me set the scene for you properly, because this is where the whole story lives. Devonport sits up on the north coast of Tasmania, right where the Mersey River opens out into the sea. There's a salt breeze coming off that river that hits you the second you step out of the car. Quiet streets, neat little houses. And out across the water, if you time it right, you can watch the big red and white ferry, the spirit of Tasmania, come sliding in from the mainland, slow and heavy and calm. That's the sound of the place. Water, wind, and not much hurry at all. And there it was. My little brick flat, 2 streets back from the water, with a for lease sign still stuck in the front garden. 2 bedrooms, nothing fancy. But mine, if the paperwork went my way. One thing that had been sitting heavy on me was that deposit. That's the part I dreaded most. Back home, I'd been burned before, watched money disappear at the end of a lease with a shrug and no explanation. So the idea of handing over 4 weeks' rent to a stranger and just hoping, that kept me up a night or two. What I didn't know yet, standing on that path, was that the bond here doesn't go into the landlord's back pocket at all. It's held somewhere else entirely, protected. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Be honest with yourself for a second. What's the one thing you're quietly afraid of about renting over here? Is it the money vanishing, the being turned away, the feeling that you don't belong on the form? Hold that thought. Because mine was all three wrapped into one, right up until the front door opened. I stood there on the step with my weathered hands full, the lease crinkling, the keys jangling, my heart going a little quick. Everything I'd expected. The cold check, the suspicion, the tolerated foreigner treatment, it was all about to be tested in about 10 seconds flat. This was the moment. Either my fear was dead right, or it wasn't. I heard footsteps inside. Then the door swung open, and there he stood. The landlord. A wiry fella in his 70s, thin as a fence post, with paint still drying on his boots. The exact man I'd built up in my head as the one who'd size me up as a risk and treat me like a stranger on paper. His name was Bruce. And what he did next was the last thing I saw coming. Bruce turned out to be a wiry fella in his 70s with paint still on his boots, running a few flats near the Mersey River, and the first thing he did was shake my hand like he'd known me for years. Not a form in sight yet. So I let my guard down a little, and we got down to the numbers. He walked me through the little brick flat, 2 streets back from the water, and he wasn't in any hurry. He tapped the wall by the window and said, "Good bones, this one. You'll be warm in here come winter." That was it. No credit check speech, no sizing me up like a stranger who might skip out on him, just a man showing another man a place to live. So let me read you the rent the way I read my own bank statement, plain and honest, because this is the part you really came for. Take a guess at what a 2-bedroom coastal flat costs here. Before I say it, then hear how close you were. Got a number in your head? All right. 390 Australian dollars a week. That's about 255 US dollars. For a 2-bedroom flat, a short walk from the beach on the north coast of Tasmania. Now let that settle for a sec. I've got a buddy back home, retired down in Florida, and he pays more than double that for a small place with a parking lot for a view. Double. When I first did that math at Bruce's kitchen table, I actually laughed out loud. He must have thought I'd lost it. And here's the thing that really eased my mind, the bond. Back in the States, you folks know the drill. You hand over a big deposit, and it disappears into somebody's back pocket, and when you move out, you're begging to see a dime of it again. That was the exact worry I'd carried onto the plane. If the disappearing deposit is your worry, breathe out. Here's how it actually works. The bond here was 4 weeks' rent, but, and this is the good part, it doesn't go to Bruce at all. It gets held by a government office, a neutral third party. Bruce never touches it, never spends it, can't just decide to keep it. When I move out and the place is in good shape, that money comes back to me, not to his pocket, to mine. I'll tell you, when I understood that, a knot in my chest I didn't even know I was carrying just let go. The whole reason I'd braced for a cold, transactional mess back in the States, a deposit vanishing, a landlord holding all the cards, that just wasn't the deal here. The bond was protected, full stop. So let's keep reading the statement, because the rent's only one line. Electricity ran me about 95 Australian dollars a month in the mild season. That's springtime, autumn, when you're barely running the heat and you're not fighting any summer either. $95, that's about what I used to hand over for a single tank of gas back home, and here it lit and warmed a whole flat for a month. And the first grocery shop, the big one, stocking an empty kitchen from scratch, 140 Australian dollars. That filled the fridge, the pantry, the lot, coffee, eggs, bread, meat, veg, the works. I carried it all in from the ute in 2 trips and stood there looking at a full bench thinking, well, I could get used to this. Now, I promised you honest, so here's the part that wasn't smooth. And every one of these stories has one, or it's not worth your trust. The genuinely awkward bit was the rental history. See, back home I'd rented and owned for 40 years, spotless record. But an Australian landlord can't see any of that. To the system here, I was a 68-year-old man with no local rental record at all, a blank page. And that's a fair thing to be cautious about, from their side. I don't blame them one bit. But it did make me feel, for a few days there, like exactly the outsider on paper. I'd feared I'd be, here's how I got past it. And it's 2 simple moves you can use yourself. First, I brought a reference letter, a plain, signed letter from my old landlord in the States saying I paid on time for years and left the place spotless. Cost me nothing but an email and a favor. Second, I offered a bigger payment up front, a little extra rent in advance, just to show good faith. That's it. A letter and a bit more money down. Bruce looked at the letter, nodded, and that was the end of the conversation. The blank page was full enough. Around here's where a lot of folks write to me, tangled up in exactly this: the paperwork, the reference letters, what to have ready before you ever land. That's honestly why I put together the little ebook and the retiree paperwork help, so you're not guessing at 3 a.m. like I was. It's the calm, prepared way in, and I'll leave it for you to look at. No pressure at all. Now, back to the porch. And here's what surprised me before the big surprise. The street itself. The morning after I moved in, I was out front fussing with a box, and the woman next door over the fence, mug of tea in hand, just waved and called out, "Welcome to the neighborhood, love." Didn't know me from Adam. The fellow across the way lifted 2 fingers off his steering wheel as he drove past, that little country wave. Nobody made a thing of the American in the brick flat. I was just the new bloke on the street. And after all that worry about being tolerated, being waved to felt like a small miracle. So there's your arithmetic, laid out on the bench. $390 a week for the flat. A bond that's protected, held safe by a government office, not somebody's pocket. Power and groceries that cost less than I'd braced for. On paper, the leap was already looking a whole lot friendlier than a gray winter back home had let me picture. But I'll be straight with you, the numbers weren't the thing that got me. The thing that got me came a few days later, and I never saw it coming. Because on the day I finally got the keys, Bruce did something odd. He dropped them in my hand, gave the door frame a little pat, and climbed back into his ute. Then he leaned out the window and said, "I'll pop back Sunday, there's something for you," and he drove off. That was it. No hint of what he meant. Something for you. I stood there in the doorway turning it over. Sunday was 3 days away. Sunday came, and I'd turned that one line over in my head for 3 days straight, "There's something for you." What does the landlord mean by that? I'll be honest, part of me still braced for a catch. Maybe a bill I'd forgotten. Maybe a form I'd missed. That old worry doesn't just switch off overnight. Early afternoon, the sun low and gold over the little brick flat, 2 streets back from the water. The cockatoos were going at it in the gum tree out front, screeching like they owned the place. And then I heard it, Bruce's ute, pulling into the driveway, that same rattly diesel from the day he handed me the keys. I stood up from the porch step, and what he unloaded is the thing I never saw coming. He swings open the back of the ute, and there's a box. A big cardboard box, the kind you'd carry your groceries in. He hauls it up onto his hip, paint still on those old boots of his, and carries it up the path like it's nothing. Sets it down on my little kitchen table. And I look inside, a sack of potatoes. Fresh silver beet, the leaves still cool and damp. A dozen eggs in a carton with the lid held shut by a rubber band. And underneath all of it, wrapped in a tea towel, a dish, a homemade lasagna, still warm. Still warm. His wife had cooked it that afternoon. "Val made a bit extra," he says, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Thought you could use a proper feed your first week." Val. That's his wife. I hadn't even met her yet, and there she was, sending a hot meal across town to a stranger who'd signed a lease 3 days earlier. Tell me honestly, did you see that coming? Because I sure didn't. I stood there in my own kitchen, 68 years old, holding a warm dish of another woman's cooking, and I didn't know what to say. And it wasn't just the food. While I was catching my breath, Bruce mentions real casual, like it's an afterthought that he'd swung by earlier in the week and fixed that sticky back door. The one that stuck in the frame every time you tried to shut it. He'd planed it down and rehung it, and now it closed with a soft little click. And on the step outside, there was a bottle of local cider. Tasmanian apples, made just down the road. No charge. No fuss. No line on any invoice. Now, let me take you back to what I told you at the start. Remember what I expected. I'd braced for cold. For a stack of forms and a credit check that couldn't read a single year of my American life. I figured a landlord would look at me, no local rental history, a foreigner with nothing to show on paper, and treat me like a risk to be managed. Politely tolerated. That's the picture I carried across the Pacific. And here was the exact opposite. Standing in my kitchen with paint on his boots, the man I'd feared would treat me as a stranger had walked in the door and welcomed me like a neighbor. Like I'd lived on that street for years. Kindness, handed over at the door, warm in a tea towel. That's the thing I didn't expect. Not the paperwork, not the numbers. The paperwork worked out fine, the numbers added up. What caught me completely off guard was that Bruce didn't stay long. He never does. He had a cup of tea, told me which fish shop by the Mercy to trust and which to skip, and then he climbed back into his ute and rattled off down the street. I stood on the porch with the cockatoos still carrying on overhead, and I ate a plate of Val's lasagna for dinner. Best meal I'd had since I landed. So let me put the whole thing back on the table for you, plain and clear, the way I've been doing all along. Because I don't want you to walk away with just a nice feeling. I want you to walk away with the arithmetic. The flat 2 bedrooms, 2 streets back from the water in Devonport, $390 Australian dollars a week. That's under $260 US dollars a week for a coastal home on the edge of Tasmania. Under $260. My buddy back in Florida pays more than double that for a smaller place with no view of anything but the parking lot. The bond, 4 weeks up front, sitting safe in a government office, not in any landlord's back pocket. If I do right by the place, I get every cent of it back. That's the law here, and it took a real weight off my shoulders when I understood it. And now, add the part I never could have put in a spreadsheet. A neighbor who shows up on a Sunday with potatoes from his own garden and a hot meal from his own kitchen. You can't budget for that, but it's real, and it's out here, and it's more common than you'd ever guess from a gray winter back home. Now, I promise you honesty all the way through, so let me name the hard part one last time. The genuinely awkward stretch was the rental history. As a newcomer with no Australian record, you don't slot neatly into the system. I had to lean on a letter and a bigger payment up front to make it easy for Bruce to say yes. That's the friction. That's the one thing I'd tell you to prepare for calmly before you come. It's a small hurdle, not a wall, but I won't pretend it isn't there. And once you clear it, it turned out warmer than I ever dared hope. 10 years I've been in this country now, and I still think about that first Sunday. The man I was afraid of turned out to be the man who fixed my door for free and fed me my first week. So picture your own numbers for a second. The flat, the protected bond, a neighbor at your door. It's closer than a gray winter makes it feel. Sit at your kitchen table tonight, wherever you are, and do the math the way I just did. Under $260 a week for the roof. A bond you get back. And people who meet you not with suspicion, but with a box of vegetables and a lasagna still warm from the oven. That's the whole story I set out to tell you. I stood outside that little brick flat at 68, keys in my hand, braced for the door to be cold. And what was waiting for me instead was warmth I hadn't earned yet and got anyway. The leap looks enormous from where you're sitting. I know it does. I sat there too, staring out at a gray sky, wondering if a man my age had any business starting over on the far side of the world. But from over here, on this porch, with the salt breeze coming off the water and the cockatoos winding down for the evening, I can tell you the truth of it plainly. Tasmania is closer than it looks. And the people here are kinder than a long gray winter will ever let you believe. That's not a dream. That's just a Sunday and a box at the door.